Here we go. All right. For those of you who are in the honors section and have questions, I've answered this a couple of times for the paper that's due tomorrow. And remember, this is only the honors section. Those of you who are enrolled in WGSS section do not have a paper due tomorrow. So you can tune out for a second. But for those of you in the honors section, let me just share my screen for a minute. The big question is, do I have to do everything in a file or do I just pick? And the answer is you just pick. So for instance, I have June of 1970 pulled up right here. June of 1970 has a lot of artifacts in it, and every single one of the files most of them are like this, where it's just a batch of artifacts from a particular month and year. So like, as you can see here, there's an artifact for like, this is a NWRO statewide newsletter. And you don't have to do the entire newsletter either. Like you can pick and choose like within. So like right here, there's this since you asked column. So if this is what you want to write on, then you could just identify it in your paper as, you know, the NWR newsletter from 1970 since you asked column, right? You don't have to do the entirety of this whole file because there's a lot of stuff here. Or like you could do, you know, as you scroll down, like here's an article from the Grand Rapids Press. You could just do this article. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. If anyone has a question, pipe up now and let me know.
I do. Is the paper supposed to be double spaced?
Yeah, double spaced, 2 to 3 pages. And remember, like you're gonna have to do a short presentation in class. That's the second part of this assignment, so that you can talk about the connections that you're drawing. So if anybody wants, I'll first of all encourage you to look ahead because that's due next week. But it's just 3 PowerPoint slides. And the question was, do we have to follow APA format? I don't care as long as you're consistent. So pick one and stick to it. And the other question is, are they on Canvas or on my website? They're actually in both places. If you go to Canvas, that's the easiest way to get to it, is to go to Canvas and click on Pages, and you'll see that it is linked right there. So let me see if I can share my screen too. All right, so here's our, can everybody see our Canvas class? I don't know if you're seeing what I want you to see, but if you go to Pages, it says NWRO artifacts, and you can just click on this Google Drive link. So does that make sense to everybody? You can also go to my website. I shared that in class as well if you still have that link. But this is obviously an easy way to get there.
The artifacts that we talked about last Friday, are those eligible, or do we have to pick something different?
No, those are eligible. Those are just, I didn't identify where those came from. You know, I just copied and pasted in one big Word document. So you might, I think they're mostly from 1969. So if you go into 1969, you can probably find them there. I think that I just was exploring one year. But yeah, anything is not off the table if we've already talked about it. It's totally fine. You really just have to pick one thing, right? It's a short paper, so you just pick one thing and just kind of reflect on it, make your connections, et cetera, et cetera. It's all lined out in the assignment. So any more questions about this? Okay. So today is a discussion day, and I went through your reading reflections last night, and I kind of grouped everybody by which questions you were answering to start with. So just as a reminder, I put this in comments for those of you who aren't doing it, but when you write your reading reflections, please write your answers in 2 separate paragraphs with the number ahead, because it makes it so much quicker for me to be able to grade them. To not have to decipher which questions you're answering. So, so I've got us divided into some breakout groups. A number of you wrote about things that surprised you, and those kind of fell into 3 different I guess, areas of emphasis. You had a lot of you wrote about the story of Linda Taylor and the Welfare Queen, which I have the book here in front of me if anybody wants to dive a little bit more into that. A lot of you wrote about things that you learned about the evolution of the party system and different political parties. And a lot of you wrote about the strict father notion from the article, from the book chapter. I had a number of you wrote about things that might have confused you. And so I labeled the breakout room confusing, but that's not to mean that you're confusing. It just means that these are things that, that might have caused you to scratch your head and puzzle over them. So the three things that kind of came up there were how this military spending situation works and why that might have a decrease or decrease impact on social spending, and then also why is it that the rich get richer with military spending. And then there were a couple of people who were puzzling over like separation of church and state and the rise of the religious right. Got a handful of you who made some new connections. Some themes that you see there are about, again, some stuff about political parties, public discourse, the purity myth. And so I've got you all in one group, and then a handful of you said that you were inspired to take some kind of action. So I have divided you all into breakout rooms. I think those of you who might have just joined aren't in a breakout room yet. So when I send everybody to breakouts, I'll get you assigned. So what I want you all to do is to spend like the next 15 minutes, and we'll come back at 1:30. Spend like the next 15 minutes just sharing what you wrote and your reflections. I've kind of, you know, like I said, I've got you grouped thematically. And so hopefully everybody in your group is gonna have been thinking about the same thing. So just kind of talk, and then when we debrief, when we come back, just have somebody appointed to kind of give us a brief report on what your group talked about, and we'll go from there. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can send people to breakouts. And then, like I said, if you don't go to a breakout immediately, I'll get you assigned to one. So, all right, I am opening the rooms. Hey, Olivia, I've got you on here. Oh, here you go. All right, you're sending you to a strict father. See, do we have everybody back? Nope, still people coming. All right. So we have about 25-ish minutes left. And so, you know, that should give each group 3 to 5 minutes to kind of report out and see what you all talked about. So I'm going to start with surprising, and I'll start with the Queen. So what did you all think? What was surprising about finding out about Linda Taylor's story, and what all did you take away from that?
Yeah, so our group basically all kind of thought the same thing, in which we weren't really surprised by the fact that this stigma lives on, and that like they cherry picked her as an example to kind of further this stereotype, but more that we're surprised by the fact that like her name is forgotten yet it still lives on, and that this like builds upon the disproportionate effect by like African American women today, and how they're like individualizing Black women, and how this like kind of adds to the belief that it's like the fault, their own fault, and then like this is attributed to like the difficult eligibility standards, and kind of just creating an overall cognitive shortcut.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, the cognitive shortcut. It's a cognitive shortcut when you say welfare queen. That is, you know, the lecture on Monday talked about racial coding. That's racially coded. It's not the only example, for sure, of racially coded language that gets used regularly, but this is, it is really interesting to dive into the story of Linda Taylor. I had come across newspaper articles before that mentioned Linda Taylor, and in this book, it actually, one of the first ones that I remember seeing is actually quoted in here because it stood out in my mind. It was her house got broken into. I don't remember the year, but her house got broken into, and she claimed that people got away, the people who robbed her got away with like diamond rings and thousands of dollars, and the headlines were very sensational and they were very bold. They were like, welfare queen gets robbed. I think that's what the headline was actually. And it stood out to me when I was doing my own independent research, because I was like, wow, it's crazy that this person is just referred to as welfare queen. You know, I didn't really anticipate that being in a newspaper, and I didn't know the background. Her story is from an individual person's perspective. She did a lot of bad things, but her story is I was talking earlier in office hours. It's a sad story. It's she encountered a lot of hardships in her life early on. Being born in the South, I think she was born in the 1920s, to a white mother and a Black father. The white family members treated her like a complete outcast. And to the extent that like she wasn't allowed in the house sometimes, or they would force her to stand outside when they would go and visit. And so there are all kinds of, you know, from the lens of today, looking back at her life, I just wonder about like different interventions that could have been done early on that could have completely changed the trajectory of her life, and how her story is a very individual story. And it is just astounding to see how it got picked up by politicians and morphed into what it eventually morphed into, to the extent that, you know, her legacy, you know, of the supposed welfare fraud is very long reaching, even though no one remembers her name. So it's I do recommend the book. But any other thoughts about Linda Taylor? Anything you wanted to add? Okay, well, those are good points. The second surprising thing that you all had was about the shifts in political parties. So which groups for that? It was Laura, Sarah, Manny, Olivia. Who wants to talk there?
Yeah, we just talked about how we thought it was surprising how both the Democratic and Republican Party appealed to the white racism because they knew that it was effective in gaining the white working class support.
Mhm.
And when the Democrats saw that the Republicans' appeal to this was effective, they wanted to follow. So even though they knew that they had to continue to support the affirmative action to keep their support among Blacks, so they did it as like subtly as they could. So when they followed suit, they just called for cutbacks in social programs such as the AFTC, but which disproportionately affected people that were in the minority. And they also created bipartisan campaigns to get tough on crime, which ended up filling prisons with primarily non-white people. And we just said that like it was surprising that both parties were appealing to this racism, and like because normally you don't like think of it that way. So when I was reading it, I just thought it was really surprising.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there any connections, and this can be anybody, any group, any connections that you all kind of thought about in terms of changes in, or any applications or aha moments or anything you had reading about kind of these shifts in the political parties and how even the Democrats kowtowed to racism, like any links that you have for today, things that you're thinking about?
I was in the call to action group, and like my main reason that I was called to action from this reading was because I realized that like their simple decision to like try and get more voters by appealing to like racist white people in the 1970s has basically changed the whole like scope of politics today. It's like essentially politics is now like if you're racist, you're Republican, and if you're not, you're a Democrat. And it's like everything's shifted right. So even more moderate people that believe in limited government, like myself, are like classified as a Democrat simply because we also believe in climate change. And it's like things that shouldn't be debated in politics and like how politics should be, which is like debating over how government should operate. Like that's not what it is anymore. It's debates about abortion. It's debates about whether like LGBTQIA people have like rights, you know, like it's debates over topics that aren't even political in a sense, because it's debates about like whether this country is racist or not, essentially. And so that was like why I was called to action, is because like to try and undo what they did by changing their style of advertising and policy to appeal to more voters. Yeah.
Yeah. I from the hindsight, you know, of being here now and being able to look in the past, you can see how these things came, like the wheels are starting to turn in particular directions, the trains move in a certain way, people are jumping on it, and you know, we can see now that it was heading in the wrong direction in a lot of instances. And I do hope that if there's one thing that you can take away from this, it's that this change doesn't happen immediately. There are a lot of places where you can intervene and a lot of ways that you can intervene in whatever you're talking about. It doesn't have to be poverty policy. It can be whatever interests you, right? Like change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. There are opportunities for you to get involved at a variety of different places and, you know, and exercise your, you know, rights as a constituent and speak up and contact those who are in power. And like, there's a meme going around right now that says, you know, and I'm not making any judgments on how old you are, so don't take this to heart if you're not of legal drinking age, but it's like, we're grown-ups now, you can drunk dial a senator, right? And it has like senators' telephone numbers on it. So, you know, like, it doesn't have to be a formal letter. Speaking up can be done in a lot of different ways, and you never know, you know, there can be some impacts that come from it in whatever issue you care about. So yeah, thanks for that. All right, anybody else have anything? Oh, I guess, no, we have political parties probably coming up again in a few minutes, so let's skip that for a second. Let's go to the strict father. That was Lexi B, Jasmine, Olivia A. What do you all have to say about that?
So we kind of talked about how it was almost surprising to us how that strict father model was like almost like a simple idea, but oh, thanks. I like my poster too. But the model was like a simple idea, but it was like directly institutionalized in a way where everything was like sort of a policy that was like connected to that. And then we also talked about how it kind of reminded us of like coverture in a way, and how the like male can directly just basically cover up the female's like authority. And then what else did we talk about? Oh yeah, and we also talked about how it was like weird that it was just generalized that people just needed paternal protection. Like people just were weak and they needed people to protect them that were always like a male. And we just talked about how that was like contradictory in a way to what the rest of the article was saying, and that that idea that people were just inherently enabled to like take care of themselves was kind of like hard to like conceptualize for us.
Yeah, that's a really good
Back on
point.
that. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
The strict father thing was saying like you need to like it's more conservative, like work for what you have and all that stuff, but then at the same time it's like you have to depend on your male figure in your life, but also don't depend on nobody. So it's like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, the strict father model kind of like, you know, based on what I just said, my little plea to be politically active, you know, it's kind of hard to imagine, I don't know, in that kind of model, like how that's supposed to work for constituents to actually be able to make demands on policymakers. That'd be like the children making demands on the father, you know, it's kind of it's a weird model. Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about how politics works. And, you know, when you hear the term paternalistic, it gives you a different kind of take on what that might mean, especially in policymaking. But it also really does bolster those ideas that we have about like the individualized pathology of people who are at the whims of needing public assistance because they're viewed as proof. They're proof positive that, you know, the system has to help people, only the system sometimes doesn't want to. So it's an interesting catch-22. Yeah, good job. Let's see, what do we have next? We've got, all right, so confusing, not confused. What did you all, I know you all had a couple of different things that you were talking about. So what did you all talk about?
So the first issue that we covered is the intersection of religion and politics lately, and how our country was originally established as a place where religion is free and stuff like that. But then religion has kind of, through the actions that took place in the Republican Party during the 1970s, become intertwined with a lot of different political debates, and about like the importance of remembering that our country is not like a religious state. Like we have many different religions and beliefs throughout our country. And the second thing that we addressed was basically the kind of hypocrisy that wealthy corporations and individuals insist that their taxes be lowered. And we just thought that was really interesting because like taxes benefit everyone in this society, creating schools, roads, the postal system, things that we all need and use. And so we thought it was really interesting how the rich constantly advocate for their own taxes to be cut when people on other ends of the spectrum can barely pay their own. And then the final issue that we covered is the idea that basically the Republican Party has a tendency in more conservative individuals to push for a stronger military. And we were kind of wondering why. And there were a couple of different motivations we explored, including patriotism or the potential business benefits for manufacturers of weapons. That was it in a nutshell. Sorry, I tried to quickly cover those three very large topics.
Yeah, you were the all over the place kind of group. I didn't, there wasn't necessarily a single theme, but those are three really good things to throw out there and to think about. you know, the religious elements and the rise of the religious right and the effects on political parties. You know, I think it was Jenny, I think he was just talking about things like LGBTQIA plus rights, and those being a focus of debate. That has long been a focus of the religious right in the United States as it began to gain power in the 1980s. And so it strongly influences political leaders. And you might, you know, in their current administration may have, you know, it often makes me scratch my head and wonder why there are such strong evangelical Christian support when he doesn't really have any evangelical Christian street cred at all, unlike previous presidents that may be more closely aligned with that agenda in, you know, their own personal lives or whatever. So it's an interesting thing. I studied my dissertation research looked at marriage policy as an offshoot of welfare reform and the support and the promotion of married two-parent families. And I did a longitudinal analysis of different social movements, including the religious right from the 1980s into the early 2000s, and looked at how they evolved. I interviewed a lot of people from the religious right, and it was really interesting because despite the fact that I was writing this, and this is just a methodological thing for those of you who are interested in doing gender studies research, even though I'm working on a PhD in women and gender studies at the time, the fact that I was a married heterosexual white woman who was interviewing them, it was really interesting because they almost all assumed that I was like firmly in their corner, that like I viewed the world the same way that they did, because I matched a profile that they thought a person should have. And so as part of, you know, since I was doing qualitative research, as part of that, I reflected on that and how that might have affected the types of answers that they gave me and things like that. So it's just a methodological aside, but a lot of feminist and gender studies research will be very, very careful to kind of analyze the role of the researcher and how that might affect the research that you're getting. But it was interesting because it was like, I didn't, you know, say anything to counter it. I was just trying to ask the same questions and keep things as methodologically similar as I could across movements. But it was apparent, and I thought it was interesting. On the defense spending part of things, for any of you who are puzzled around that, so there's a really basic economic model called bread and butter. I mean, no, arms and butter. Arms and butter is what it's called, not bread and butter. Arms and butter, and it's basically it's an economic model that looks at a production possibilities frontier, and it's a very simple exercise where you're assuming a nation state it can only make two products, either military products or food. Basically, that's where you get the arms and the butter from. And the argument in it is basically like, if you've only got those two products in a market system, then what you can potentially produce of one is going to be affected by the production of the other. And so if you're increasing your production of your weapons or your military, then you're going to find a decline in the available food. So that's like a very basic principle that underlies a lot of this chapter when it's talking about kind of the trade-offs between military spending and public welfare support. There are a lot of ways, government contracts, investments, things like that, where the rich benefit from increased military spending much more so than pouring additional money into making low-end, you know, food that's primarily going to, you know, it's going to be very dispersed. It's not food's not high dollar. You know, it's not, you're not going to make a ton. Farmers already get a ton of subsidies to create it in the first place. And it doesn't work the same sort of way. So when you have your simple model, you're going to find that a lot of times governments are going to make sure that defense spending is at a certain level, even if there are potential trade-offs. in social services, because it lines pockets, and it also, you know, does feed some of these things that Sydney talked about, like patriotism. And there were real threats in the 70s and 80s. It was the height of the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those things are also important, but good job. All right, next we have confusing connections. What did you all talk about?
We kind of, a lot of common themes have come up of stuff we've already talked about, but one thing we talked about is how like humanitarian issues are becoming like more politicized, and like you can definitely feel like which parties lean certain ways, and a lot of people are voting on the basis of that, which I feel like isn't really how parties were intended to be. And another thing we talked about was about how certain corporations were like aligning with parties, and like especially like the Republican Party, and like the like basic like white male people thought that that was like benefiting them, but really they were kind of just like lining the pockets of the corporations. Know that. We also talked about like discourse, if somebody else wants to chime in about that in the group.
Yeah, I guess to kind of like piggyback, piggyback, that's a phrase, on that, like with the discourse, like that was especially like distracting, and like that's kind of what turned like all these, what kind of like politicized the humanitarian issues that at least existed at the time, / like turned the political parties into culture. Like this just like, it became like a part of who these white uneducated families, or these like white patriarchal families like identified with. And like Rachel said, it's a distraction of like what is grander than the policies that they're hearing about, like the policies that they may actually be benefiting from. Somebody commented on that just based on like their own personal experience, like they may actually be benefiting from these policies that are like being done away with, or they're like not realizing that there are like bigger corporations behind it, there's somebody else's interest behind it, and like they're just because like they have this belief in the story doesn't mean that they're actually like have any agency in the matter. Like I think even more so, like believing in a grander story, you like lose your free will if we like bring it out to that level of stuff. But yeah, if other members of the group want to cut in and say something.
All right, that was great. And I think we only got we've got 3 more minutes left, but I think that that translates well into the last one, which was connections. So I know that you all talked about some corporate PAC stuff as some of your connections and our items. What else did you have? Who's presenting there? Group number action, number 5. That was Anna, Mallory, Jenny, Rachel. Which one of you is speaking?
Yeah, we all had like pretty different actions, but they all kind of like, I feel like stemmed from a similar place, which is that like we felt like the party system that we're going off of has shifted. Like some of us, like the actions were like voting or like educating ourselves or like volunteering. And like for one of our group, the action was just like getting involved in politics, like as an adult, like as like a potential career path. But like we all kind of discussed like how politics in the United States have become like more based on morals and based on like ideas about government. And like we like kind of made a joke about how like it's interesting like turning on the debates and like watching them like decide whether or not you should get rights, you know. But yeah, like basically like what we talked about is just that politics are shifting to the right just because like everything's becoming like moralized. Like when that's happening, like the extreme viewpoints are going to cause a shift. But if anyone else from the group wants to chime in if I missed something.
Yeah, so basically what Rachel said, we talked about like how politics have become diluted and things have become just about voting with party and not voting with belief. And basically what Rachel said, but we all just want to get more involved in politics in our own way to maybe educate ourselves or to not contribute to that problem.
That's great. Anna, not to put you on the spot, but you wrote about corporate PACs, political action committees, and you don't have to talk about it. I'll just throw it out there right quick, but just wanted to just let you all know that public contribution or political contributions are public, right? above, I think the threshold's $99. So I think it's above that is public information. So if you ever wanted to look up and see which corporations, who they're supporting, like, you know, in terms of being just a more informed consumer, or if you're looking about getting, you know, at a job and you're trying to decide between a couple of different companies, you could look to see if they are supporting any type of political candidates, and whether, and you can make that choice about whether or not that's something that you like or don't like, right? Like that's one of the great things about there being so much information out there that people don't know that they can necessarily tap into, but you can become informed. Encourage you to become informed. Don't just you know, make your decisions based on the memes, although drunk dialing a senator or just dialing them sober is always a good idea. You know, just know about things, know about the history, know about how stuff has evolved, inform yourself. And so that's kind of like a big takeaway, I think. I liked that there were a number of you that wrote about wanting to take action, because, you know, I think that this is an important thing. If it doesn't, I'm not trying to prescript any sort of political agenda on anybody, but just to know that we all have equal access to information, and we should take advantage of that information in whatever way you want. So, all right, we're out of time. Y'all have a good afternoon. Let me know if you have any questions about the paper, for those of you writing it, and I'll see you Friday. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.